What I would like to start to say is that the European Union was confronted with a number of problems. For instance, very sluggish growth rates, lots of unemployment, and so on. In 2000, there was a number of more left-wing parties in government. It was a socialist party in Portugal and so on. And so they, in the council in Lisbon in the year 2000, they presented the Lisbon Strategy. The Lisbon Strategy, in a sense, was an idea to compensate for the problems that were created by the establishment of the European Monetary Union and for neoliberal policies linked to the development of internal markets. So the idea was modernizing the European social model, increasing employment, protecting an aging population, and fighting against social exclusion. Unfortunately, there were a number of critical voices. For instance, Iverson and Ren, they just said offering simultaneously employment, income inequality, and fiscal restraint is just impossible. Or Krill and Eto'o, who said that offering simultaneously to attain growth, productivity, social inclusion, and sustainable development looks like the quintessential contemporary utopia and the end of political trade-offs. Other voices, like Ledendorf, he has written a book called The Triumph of Failed Ideas, European Models of Capitalism in Crisis. He also said that the EU single market project and the European Monetary Union are fatally flawed due to their unbalanced focus on free markets without adequate countervailing social and labor standards, and on price stability and austerity without adequate reference to sustainable economic development, employment, and social equity. So when the Lisbon Strategy was defined, there were initially a number of critical voices. And unfortunately, they were right. The Lisbon Strategy was a failure. In 2004, there was a report by a Dutch politician, Wim Kok, he presided over the Commission, and he recognized already that there was a disappointing delivery of the Lisbon Strategy due to an overloaded agenda, poor coordination, and conflicting priorities. Still, a key issue has been the lack of determined political action. And this was recognized by the Commission. When the Commission presented Strategy 2020, which was something different from the Lisbon Strategy, trying to make amendments, the Commission said, the steady gains in economic growth and job creation witnessed over the last decade have been wiped out. And the 23 million people, or 10% of our active population, are now unemployed. The crisis has exposed some fundamental weaknesses of our economy. And so this is a problem that we have been facing. This creates a paradox, because we have now the better educated young population. And in general, what happens when you change generation, the next generation will live better than the previous one. I've lived better than my parents have lived better than my grandparents, and so on. And for the first time, the next generation will live worse than we did. And this is really a problem. This has to do with the neoliberalism and the attitude of the Commission, who has paid so far more attention to creating internal markets than to friendly social policies. And this picture, the next picture, explains why this is happening. This was taken from Eurostat. The internal polygon is its situation in 2008. The blue one is situation in 2014. and the outer one are the targets of 2020. You see that there was very good progress in things like greenhouse gas emission, share of renewable energy in gross final energy consumption, and so on and so on, even in education. But there are two areas where in 2014 we were far worse than in 2008. And those areas are people at risk of poverty and social exclusion, and the employment rate in the age group 20 to 64, which means that indeed the social component of European policies has completely failed. And this probably explains why today many European citizens are not very happy with the situation. The third problem is with the investment in research and development. As you can see, there has been very little progress in this area. And so these are the main problems of Europe. Let me go on and show you a number of examples. The idea of the Lisbon Strategy was to create a European of knowledge and knowledge-based economy, and that this would make everyone happy. And however, to implement a knowledge-based policy, you needed a well-educated workforce. And as we had the Bologna process, which in a sense opened the way for intervention of the Commission in the area of higher education. And the higher education, in principle, was protected by the treaties. It was a reserve of every country. And now the Bologna process allowed the Commission to interfere. And so as we have the need of a well-educated population and to have policies in this area, European policies, there was an appropriation of the Bologna process by the Lisbon Strategy, and which was initially something based on generous ideas of values and culture to higher education that has moved to make higher education a service of short-term needs and demands of the economy. So there was a complete change in emphasis in what the European Union expected from higher education. The Commission linked the Bologna objectives directly to economic gains expected from a common education area and uses services directive to create a market for higher education. The Service Directive tried to create an internal market in the area of services, and education was included in Services Directive. And this means that, for instance, if we have a British university operating in Portugal, provided that this institution is accredited by the British authorities, there is no way the Portuguese government can interfere. So in a sense, the idea was to create a market of higher education where it was easy for one country to operate in a different country without restrictions. Now, and obviously, the Commission has a very utilitarian view of education and research. We say I was just trying. There's a problem with this. We don't have a computer and we cannot see the notes. This is a problem. I've combined this with papers. So the idea is that from the Commission is the higher education institutions are supposed to supply the labor market with the graduates having the skills needed for shared terms of the economy, and research is seen as producing direct benefits for society, which explains the Commission's preference for applied research. Now, one of the problems I'll skip this one because we are late and move into Europe and global competition. I'm going to present three components. First one, Europe and global competition. Second one is the case of Southern European countries. And the third place, also the heterogeneous situation inside each country. So one of the problems of Europe was that there was a gap in the investment in the research and development when compared with the industrialized competitors like United States, Japan, North Korea, and so on. Unfortunately, there was no progress in this area, as we'll see. The colored line represents the European average. So you'll see that there was no great progress when comparing Europe with the United States, with Japan, with South Korea. And if you look into China, even China is now very close in research and development investment when compared with Europe. There's a star in China because it's China without Hong Kong. Those are the data, the available data. But the situation is even worse if we decompose the components of the expenditure. If you look into the enterprise and business sector, so to the private sector, we'll see that situation is, the gap is there. Is lack of investment in European companies. You see that South Korea is increasing very fast, same with Japan. The United States has remained more or less constant, but well above the European investment. And you see that China companies are already investing more in research and development than European companies. If you go into higher education, the situation is completely different. In the case of higher education, you will see that Europe is quite well. China is starting, so it's has very low investment. And if you go into the government sector, so you'll see again that Europe lies below all the other countries, all the other areas, and this is our major problem. So we are not so bad in investments in the case of the higher education sector, but we are very poor in the case of the private sector, and we have a big problem also in the government sector. And this explains why Europe has problems of competition. If you look into education, this is data from last year. And again, you'll see that in the case of Europe, 2022, this is data that we have in the Eurostat, we are still below Korea, Japan, and the United States. And again, so that there's a gap both in higher education and in investments in research and development, which might explain some of the problems of lack of competitiveness of the European region. Now I'll move into regional convergence policies. So the idea of Europe was to reduce the gap between the new incoming countries, is to make a lot of investments, structural funds, and so on and so on. However, the problem of the way the European Union was set up has created difficulties with integration. What we see after 30 years of investments is that the regions like Southern European regions were not able to close the gap with the European Union. There are contradictions between different national capitalisms, and I'll go back into this later. And there is a division of the labor between countries which are mainly exporters and countries which are mainly importers, and the easily accessible credit and low interest rates allows the creation of huge national debts, as is, for instance, the case of Portugal. But let's go back again into detail, more detail. Investment and research and development. I'll move into this. So the blue one represents Portugal. The other line is the European average. The black circles is Germany, which I'm used for comparison. So you can see that when you look into total investment in research and development, all the Southern European countries are far below the European average, and they're far below what happens in Germany. Again, we can look into the composition. The enterprise and business sector, Germany is doing much better than the European average. You'll see that the European average is far above what happens in the other four Southern European countries. So one of the reasons that explains why we are lagging is because the investment in the private sector, in business and enterprise sector, is lower than should be. If we go into the higher education sector, we have a surprise. It was a surprise for me. Portugal, as a percentage of GDP, is investing more than the European average. Is above the European average. And then the other three countries are slightly below. Germany is more or less at the European level. If you look into the government sector, again, you'll see that Portugal is extremely low. Investments are very, very low in the government sector. Germany is quite above the European average. And Spain is more or less at the European average. So we have here a problem, because if you look in public investment in research and development, there's no problem with the higher education sector, which is apparently doing well, although we all complain. But the major problem lies with the private sector, so the companies, and lies with government investments. The state laboratories, the financing of state laboratories has decreased substantially, and so there is this difference between Portugal and the other countries. If we look into human resources, you get a similar picture. The total investment, the percentage in Germany is well above the European average, and all the other countries in Southern Europe show this kind of picture. Then we go again into the business sector, we decompose. The main problem is again in business and enterprise sector. I will see where Portugal is converging slightly with Spain. But in any case, percentage of research and development personnel in the workforce is still very low, and Germany is substantially high. And if you move into the higher education sector, again, you see Portugal doing very well. Surprisingly, the same happened with Greece. But when you go into the government sector, you again see the situation of Portugal much lower than the European average. And surprisingly, you see an increase in the case of Greece, and Germany, as usual, is doing very well. Now, human resources in science and technology, Portugal has been slowly catching up with the other European countries. Germany is again above the European level, the European average. Now, education. Here we have a big problem, because the percentage of the population between 15 to 64 years old with less than primary and lower secondary education is very high. It was over 70% in 2005. And although there has been substantial progress, the fact is that we are still around 60% of the population with very low education levels. And you can compare this with the European average. And again, you see that Germany is doing much better than the European average. And this is a problem. And if you look into the different age ranges, you will see that the main problem is with the labor force, which is over 40 or 50, where the percentage of people with a decent level of education is still very low. I'm getting dry. Now, if you compare, I am just looking into higher education. In case of higher education, the population 15 to 64, you see that Portugal has been improving. Is again the blue line, but is still below the European average. Spain is above the European average, and Germany is more or less at the average. But there is a difference. You'll see here. If you look into population 25 to 34, you see that Portugal is closing the gap, is approaching the European average quite fast. The problem is the older population. Probably when they die, they will solve the problem. There is no alternative. And here it is 55 to 64. Look, in the case of Germany, Germany is well above the European average because it has already made the right investments in higher education. So they don't have this problem of an old population which is undereducated. But we have that problem in Portugal. And another interesting thing is when you look into the 3 to 4 levels of ESED, which corresponds to the short technical programs. Yeah, technical schools, yes. It's below, it's not higher education, it's below higher education. And here you will see that Germany has a very, very high level of people with this level of education. And Portugal is very low, although there's been some substantial increase. This has to do with this idea of the varieties of capitalism approach. The idea is that each state has its own model of capitalism, which is shaped by history, local conditions, mentality, and so on. And there are basically two extreme models, what we can call coordinated market economies. It's the case of Germany, where the trade unions are very strong, where there is collective bargaining, where most companies have long-term strategies, and where it's usual to have long-term employment. On the other extreme, this obviously allows workers to invest in highly specialized sector-specific skills. This is why in Germany, the 3-4 level of ESED have so many people, because there is not a risk. There's long-term employment, there's collective bargaining, the student unions are very strong, the student unions control a substantial component in the training of people. If you go to the liberal market economies, which is the case of the Anglo-Saxon countries, their trade unions and employer associations are generally less powerful and cohesive. Negotiations over wage coordination and labor conditions are more difficult. And in general, employment is not secure. So you are much more bound to have to change your employment along the line than if you are living in a coordinated economy. This is why having as education at ESED 3-4 level, very specialized technical training, is a risk in the countries with the liberal market economies, much more riskier than in countries with coordinated economies. In liberal market economies, it's relatively easy for firms to employ or lay off labor in order to take advantage of new opportunities, while production strategies based in commitments to long-term employment are less attractive. And individuals are encouraged to invest in general skills which are transferable across firms and in career trajectories that contemplate frequent job changes. So there is this strong difference. And this explains why Germany and the other countries are doing so well because of those people in the set 3-4, although they are not so strong in the education sector. Liberal market economies are, for instance, United States, Britain, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, Ireland. Coordinated market economies are Germany, Japan, Switzerland, Netherlands, Belgium, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Finland, and Austria. The percentage of higher education students in Austria, for instance, is relatively low when compared with Portugal. And then you have a number of countries which are in an intermediate situation. Portugal, France, Italy, Spain, Greece, and Turkey, and another type of capitalism that describes Mediterranean or mixed market economies. Again, the slow investment in research and development by the private sector, business and enterprise, and the fact that the level of education in countries like Portugal is still very low explains some of the difficulties of these countries. Obviously, together with problems with the quality of governance, which were discussed yesterday. Now, when you look now into one country, and you look into different regions inside one country, you will see that there has been no convergence. The Madalena Fonseca has done some work in this area, and she has shown that after so many years of investment, the relative position of the region inside the country have not changed. So there is no closing of gaps in general. And even worse, with the economic crisis, there has been even divergence. And there is a mismatch between higher education and the labor market, which is the most relevant problem. For instance, if you look at Portugal, in regions like Bragança or Beja or Porto Alegre and so on, it's very difficult to get qualified employment. Portugal is still very centralized. And if you move away from the coast, and if you move away from the urban regions of Porto and Lisbon, you'll have difficulties in getting qualified employment. And this was even made worse with the crisis, because many public services have disappeared from the interior and were concentrated near the coast. The low qualification level of many employers, there is data from 2008, the Instituto Nacional de Estatística has produced the results, show that at the time, 80% of entrepreneurs had at most the minimum education level. And these people will never produce qualified employment. So there is a terrible mismatch between what institutions of higher education are producing and the present needs of the market. And this is more evident near the border of Spain. People with a university degree may find difficulty in obtaining employment compatible with their qualifications. And so it's difficult to promote human capital upgrading policies without looking also into qualified job opportunities in the periphery. Now I'm going to finish with a few presentations. This is again population aged 25 to 64 with tertiary education. You can see that Lisbon is the only region where there is a substantial percentage of this kind of people. Can also you look into resources in science and technology, and you'll see more or less the same picture. If you look at the employment rates, and same thing when you look into GDP. It's interesting that in general, the GDP is higher in the regions where the capital is. Even in Greece, you can see there is a small blue region which corresponds to the capital. So I would say that the basic idea is that you cannot have the same policies for every country. You have to consider diversity. The recipes must change from country to country. And inside each country, you need better governance, and you need to look into regional disparities in a very different way. Unfortunately, in Portugal, most of the investments who go to Lisbon, even with the excuses that investments in Lisbon are national investments, which it's a paradox, because Portugal goes to Europe and claims that it needs money because it lags behind the European countries, but inside Portugal they don't pay attention to this kind of problem. Even now that Portugal has again applied to have one of the institutions that are going to be relocated because of Brexit, it's again proposed to be in Lisbon. For me, this is fascinating. I cannot. In Netherlands, it's very interesting because, for instance, the Ministry of Education is in a place called Zoetermeer, which no one knows. The Council of Rectors is in Utrecht. It's distributed. I spent there some holidays, and because I wanted to see museums, and if you want really to see what a painter has done in his life, you have to go to several towns because the collections are distributed to different towns. In Portugal, everything is in the same place. Thank you very much.